that makes me wonder why so many, not so many, but several European heads of state have discussed on a number of occasions Ukraine is going to join NATO or offering some sort of promises. Why exactly are they doing that?
Because I think that's politics. I think it's a way of saying to Russia, we continue our attitude. I mean,
Hey everyone, welcome to our fourth episode of Talk Globally, a podcast on international politics of the Honor Society Sigma Iota Rho of Webster University. We are here to talk about current events and global politics and want to shed light on various challenges humanity faces. Today, I'm excited to present to you Professor Bram Boxhoorn, an assistant professor of history and international relations at Webster Leiden campus. He received his PhD from the University of Amsterdam in 1986 and is the former director of Netherlands Atlantic Association. Today, Professor Boxhoorn and I will be discussing EU and transatlantic relations post-World War II and how the conflict in Ukraine has influenced the relationship. But before we get to that, we'd like to know a little bit about you. Where are you from? What are your hobbies? And where does your interest in EU and US relations come from?
all right. To start with the beginning, I'm from Amsterdam. My whole family is from Amsterdam. I was born there, went to school, and then to university. And actually, my first serious job was at the University of Amsterdam, where I started teaching history. I studied history, as you already mentioned. And after a while, I decided to change jobs and became director of the Atlantic Association in The Hague. So I traveled back and forth for a while. And that job has ended last year, so I'm now partially retired and still very grateful to be involved at Webster University, teaching different courses on international relations affairs.
Great. Well, I appreciate that, Professor Boxhoorn. Now, you mentioned the Netherlands Atlantic Association. Since it's related to our topic today, would you mind explaining what the association is related
to? It's an NGO, a cross-political party organization. And it focuses on organizing public events, seminars, study visits, and all that for a variety of focus groups, students, young professionals, but also civil servants at the ministries to inform them on the importance of transatlantic relations.
Understood. Well, thank you very much for sharing that. And again, it's awesome that you were able to join us today. Now, this leads us into our first question. Why is the relationship between the United States and Europe so close?
There are a couple of reasons you can think of. First of all, there are the historical ties. The US came out of a British colony, as we all know, to start with. And then there was massive immigration in the 19th and 20th century from the European continent. So there are historical relations to start with. Second, there is, if you look at transatlantic relations as a sort of network consisting of several layers, there's first then history. Second, there is the economic cooperation between the two continents, or interdependence, you should say, because we are very much dependent on each other for our welfare and the state of economic affairs. With heavy investments across the Atlantic, and a lot of jobs come out of that. So there's economy. Then there is culture. There is a lot of influence from the US on Europe regarding all sort of culture developments. Think about music, dance, and all that. On the other side, there is European influence on academic life in the US, philosophy, history, and all that. That's very close, even so close that we, tend to forget about it. And perhaps lastly, there is shared values. We are all democracies and attached to a rule of law, humanitarian law, and human rights and all that. So it's again, there are several layers in that network of transatlantic relations, and I can't say that one of these is more important than the other one, but that it is close, that is beyond doubt.
And I can definitely relate to that relationship, considering I grew up in the United States and spent the last several years here in Europe. Now, tell me this: what is NATO, and what is its role in maintaining transatlantic relationships?
That's part of that, multifaceted layer of relations. So now we come to the security dimension of that layer. NATO, founded in 1949 after the Second World War, is the sort of key pillar or organization that combines Americans and European allies in one organization, sharing the same ideas about collective security. And it's a unique organization in the sense that, in Brussels, where you find NATO headquarters, where Americans and Europeans sit around the table every day to discuss strategic issues. Well, the most pressing issue today, of course, is the war in Ukraine. But there are many other issues that are being discussed at the table over there, including security issues in the South China Sea or the Middle East or whatever. I mean, NATO is not directly involved in that, but definitely it's a very important platform where Americans and Europeans exchange views and ideas on these issues.
NATO is such a big influence on the world, and there's so many countries that are part of it. What do you think, or who do you think is the biggest player within NATO? Who do you think has the most influence?
Without doubt, that's the United States, and that's because of its military capabilities. But, and perhaps in number 2 and 3 and 4, it's the UK, France and Germany. Also, if you look at the capabilities, but more importantly, if you realize that NATO is an intergovernmental organization, it means that it's an organization of equals. So even, with due respect, Iceland could just raise its finger and says, no, we are opposed to this or that proposal or policy. And then there is no consensus. And then, NATO has to come up with a different proposal or different ideas. That's the sort of theoretical approach. But it goes without saying that the most important players, they do put the items on the agenda. What do we discuss today? What do we discuss tomorrow? And of course, if the United States or France puts a proposal on the table, it will be listened to carefully, perhaps a little bit more carefully than if Iceland or any other member state proposes something. And there is a sort of hierarchy in the organization that goes without saying. Even if, again, as I said, it's alliance of equals.
How has this conflict in Ukraine affected the transatlantic relationship in NATO as a whole?
Oh, it has affected the relationship very deeply. Absolutely, because this has seriously endangered the European security. Interestingly, also the European Union, which we haven't talked about yet, is involved in defending European democracies in this case. But NATO has been on the forefront in helping assisting Ukraine in defending itself. Also by the US again giving the example and taking the lead in organizing this assistance with military equipment, capabilities, but also politically in organizing political unity among European allies to resist Russia's influence and propaganda. And that should not be overlooked, that the US not only is a source of military capabilities, but can also be a political leader. And this was very much needed. If you think about, the complicated political relations on the European continent.
With Europe being so geographically close to Ukraine, and as we mentioned, the United States is the head of NATO, who do you think is most concerned about the conflict?
I find that difficult to answer because it's so relevant to European security that I would say, Germany is the first country that comes to my mind in this respect. But it's even closer to Poland, to the Polish border. So maybe Poland would be the first one to mention. But if you think about it broadly in a more general framework, if I remember the writings of Brzezinski, the famous scholar on strategic issues and former security advisor to President Carter, wrote a book about this in the beginning of this century, in which he analyzed a number of countries that would disintegrate if it not would be under the umbrella of the United States. And Ukraine is one of the best examples he analyzed, saying that if the US would withdraw from the European continent, then Ukraine would immediately become a sort of vassal state of Russia. And actually that's the biggest danger right now, that if Ukraine's and the allies fail to defend Ukraine territory, it will become a vassal state of Russia, as Belarus, for instance. So it has the complications are huge if the allies are not able to defend to Ukraine.
So another question I had is, when President Trump was in office, he made various threats on removing U.S. troops from Germany and other parts of Europe. I'm curious to get the opinion of a European citizen. What are your thoughts when you hear things of that sort, knowing that the United States is so integral to the safety and security of the continent?
Yeah. Well, I'm very much in favor of looking at the facts. And the fact is, I'm not going to defend Trump. I'm not in no position to do that,
right?
As a European. But well, first of all, what he said about NATO and the threat of the U.S. withdrawal, I think it doesn't make sense. Also because of an American standpoint of view, because it wouldn't help to safeguard American security in the world. But that's a different topic. Back to your question. If you look at the facts, American capabilities have been strengthened under Trump, and that has been not noticed very well. So more American troops have gone to the Baltics after 2014, and Trump has not resisted that. Maybe he was unaware of it, I don't know. But anyway, there are more American capabilities in Europe, and that's process has continued.
Okay. Now,
there was a second question attached to that.
It was just, we were talking about Trump and the extent of
and secondly, maybe that's something worthwhile to mention too. The biggest threat of what Trump has argued, he wanted a closer relationship with Russia. One of the good things of NATO, and in particular of the role of the Secretary General of NATO, Mr. Stoltenberg, of the Norwegian Secretary General, he has been able to resist that. So from that point of view, this was a defeat of Trump's ideas of a closer relationship with Russia. And Stoltenberg has been able to, sort of resist that. A good thing about Trump's insistence on more money for NATO, you remember the phrase?
I do, absolutely.
To spend at least 2% of the GDP. Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, has used this, or abused this, whatever you would like to call it, to press the Europeans to put more money into defense. And that has worked. Of course, sadly enough, the crisis in Ukraine has also helped to do this. If you look at Germany in particular, what the Germans call with the German word the Zeitenwende, so the turnaround of the situation, Germany has now invested a huge amount of money into defense in order to modernize and to catch up, because they were really at the bottom.
Sure. So you mentioned Trump wants closer ties to Russia.
Yeah.
However, on the other hand, he's telling European countries to increase their military spending. Wouldn't that be a conflict?
Yeah, of course. But Trump was very good at speaking against himself,
Sure.
saying things that didn't match with other things. He was not very. That's what it is.
Yeah.
You have to deal with it. That's politics.
I couldn't imagine being a European under the Trump presidency, obviously, with so many different things he's saying and not knowing what to expect, So.
Yeah, well, again, I'm not a politician, so
Sure.
I'm looking at it from a distance and as an observer,
Sure.
and as an historian. But believe me, if you are a French politician or a German politician, it drives you mad.
Do you believe Russia invaded Ukraine in fear of NATO expansion?
No, there are different reasons.
That was a quick
Yeah.
response.
Yeah.
Elaborate?
No, no hesitation.
Yeah.
On this question, no. The idea was, as I said, the strategic objective of Russia was to broaden its sphere of influence in Central Europe. So it already had Belarus, and it needs Ukraine in order to be able to influence the other Central European countries. There is a whole complex of ideas behind it. If you look at what Putin has outlined, his ideas about a world order and a order in Europe, it's obvious that he doesn't consider Ukraine to be a sovereign state. He considers it as a sort of province of Russia. It did have historical ties with Russia, that's to be sure. Actually, Russia started in Ukraine, more or less, historically speaking. So it has been part and parcel of Russia centuries ago. But you can't compare that with the current situation.
Sure.
Ukraine is a sovereign state and has its rights to defend its territory. But Putin and his and the Kremlin, they don't accept this. So that's why they rejected it. And that has been obvious from, if we can go back to 2007 with the famous speech of Putin at the Munich Security Conference, where he outlined his ideas. Next year he invaded Georgia because Ukraine and Georgia were supposed to join NATO very soon. At least they applied for membership. So Putin, used his usual tactics, occupying part of a territory and then create a sort of frozen conflict. So a country will never become a member of an international organization if part of its territory is occupied by a foreign state.
Sure.
So probably he's aiming for the same thing in Ukraine, occupying part of Ukraine and hoping looking at a sort of ceasefire, and then Ukraine will never become a member of NATO.
Now, do you think this will be an ongoing thing for the future?
I hope not. But you are asking now about the end situation, the end game or so?
Not necessarily, but do you think these other former Soviet states will be in the same situation as Ukraine, I guess?
Possibly. Depends a little bit on how it evolves
Sure.
in Ukraine, because it draws on the Russian military. They lost more than 100,000 soldiers over there. Estimates.
Sure.
And again, their capabilities are limited. So they can't just go into any country as they like. They have limited capabilities.
Sure.
So as long as this goes on, it will definitely limit Russia's options.
So that brings me to our next question. Do you believe the NATO response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been sufficient? And should U.S. and European states do more?
Well, they definitely should do more, but there are limits what countries can do, and we are, who has been, if you look at who has been spending and investing most of its capabilities into Ukraine, it was the US, because they have the capabilities to move them to Ukraine. The Europeans are behind, in a way, not financially, by the way. They support Ukraine with money, but you need ammunition, you need tanks, you need all these military equipment. It must come from somewhere, and so far most of it comes from the US. But the Europeans are not doing that badly. I mean, think about the German Leopard tanks that have been moved to Ukraine. But interestingly, and here I come back to American leadership. The Germans were only willing to send them to Ukraine, these Leopard 2 tanks, after the US had promised also their Abrams tanks. So the US here again is leading by example, and that tells you something. And I mean, what it tells you also, and that's something that worries me a lot. If at some point the American Congress would, or I must say, if the American president would not be able to continue this assistance because of resistance in American Congress by the Republicans, then what? Then it's up to the Europeans to do it. And I'm afraid they can't.
Yeah.
That is something that worries me.
Looking into the future, how do you see the war ending? And if Ukraine were to join NATO, would it end the conflict or exacerbate the situation?
No, if Ukraine would join NATO at this point, it would exacerbate the situation.
Sure.
Because that would, in effect, it would mean an Article 5 situation.
Yeah.
Territory of a country has been violated by another country, and then all the others should come to the aid of that particular country. So, but that's not going to happen, because there will be no membership of Ukraine under the current situation.
That makes me wonder why not so many, but several European heads of state have discussed on a number of occasions Ukraine is going to join NATO or offering some sort of promises. Why exactly are they doing that?
Because I think that's politics. I think it's a way of saying to Russia, we continue our attitude. I mean, Ukraine was promised membership of NATO in 2008 at the NATO summit of Bucharest. And the communique, if you look into the wording, it was not very successful, to put it mildly, provoking Russia a little bit, perhaps. On the other hand, countries have the right to join international organizations if they want, sovereign states. But so I think the point here is right now that we need an end of hostilities at some point. And from that point on, membership can be discussed seriously in terms of what steps need to be taken before they can actually join NATO. But that will take a while.
Understood.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a wonderful conversation, Professor Boxhoorn. Thank you very much for your time.
My privilege. Thank you for the questions.
Absolutely. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in to our 4th episode of Talk Globally. I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and be sure to join us on the next one.